Divorced and left in a blizzard, she built a downdraft smoke bench. Elias Rourke, who had 19 years inspecting claims along the Nebraska line, told her plainly, "Those girls will wait cold, and it will be on your pride." She had $23, 2 daughters, and no way to haul the timber the plains demanded. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Clara Bennett Hale had never laid a heating flue in her life. She had come to the claim in August of 1887 with 2 daughters, a milk cow whose ribs showed through its hide, 3 hens that laid poorly, and $23 folded inside a Bible she no longer opened. The land east of the Little Blue River was flat enough to break a person's sense of distance, 12 miles to the nearest rail stop, 4 miles to the nearest neighbor with a working chimney, and between Clara Bennett Hale and the winter already thinning the air at night, a house that was not a house. Martin had taken the wagon when he left. He had taken the team. He had taken the seasoned cordwood stacked against the south wall, every piece she had helped split the previous autumn. What he signed over to her was the poorer half of the claim improvements, a board and sod hybrid with a leaky roofline, a chimney thimble already settling crooked, and a cast iron stove that ate wood the way a drunk eats whiskey, fast, hot, and useless by morning. The divorce had been final 6 weeks. Ruth was 9. Eliza was 6. Neither girl understood yet what the winter would ask of them, and Clara intended to keep it that way as long as she could. She understood the math. She had always been good with accounts. Back in Iowa, her father had let her keep the books for his wagon-making shop before she was 12, and the accounts of this situation were brutal. A household on the Nebraska plains needed a minimum of 6 cords of proper hardwood to see a family through winter. 6 cords meant cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking roughly 4,800 pounds of oak or elm. Clara had no wagon strong enough to haul timber. She had no team to pull one. She had less than half a cord of mixed wood behind the house, and most of it was green cottonwood that would smoke more than it would burn. The mercantile in town extended credit, but Clara already owed $11 there, and the owner's wife watched her with the careful eyes of a woman who had seen frontier debt bury better families than this one. $23, 2 daughters, and not enough muscle, metal, or timber to do what every other settler on the plains said she had to do. The first person to say it to her face was Elias Rourke. He arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of September, riding a bay gelding with a Union Army brand still faintly visible on its hip. Rourke was 61 years old. He had served 3 years in the war, lost 2 fingers on his left hand at Shiloh, and spent the 19 years since inspecting claims along the Nebraska line for the county land office. His job was to determine whether homesteaders had made sufficient improvements to hold title. But what he really did, what everyone on the plains knew he did, was walk through a property and tell you whether you would survive the winter. His record was not perfect, but it was close enough that when Rourke said a family was short, people listened. He did not knock. The door was propped open with a stone because the latch had stripped. He stepped through, removed his hat, and looked at the room the way a doctor looks at a patient he suspects is already dying. "One room fit to sleep in," he said. He touched the wall where the sod met the board frame. His remaining fingers pressed the seam and came away with crumbled earth. "Settling. You will lose heat through this joint before November." Clara stood near the stove with her arms crossed. Ruth sat at the table copying letters. Eliza was outside chasing one of the hens. Rourke crossed to the woodpile visible through the back opening. He did not count the pieces. He did not need to. "Less than half a cord," he said, "and most of it green. You would need to burn this for a week just to season it, and then you would have nothing left to burn." "I know what I have," Clara said. "Then you know it is not enough." He turned to the chimney thimble and held his hand near the joint where the stovepipe met the wall. "Weak pull. This will smoke you out on any day the wind comes from the northwest, which on this stretch of the plains is most days between December and March." He stepped back to the center of the room. "3 bodies needing warmth," he said. 2 of them children. A stove that demanded more fuel than Clara could supply. A chimney that would fight her every time the wind shifted. And no man, no team, no wagon, and no credit sufficient to change any of it before the ground froze. "Mrs. Hale," Rourke said, and his voice carried no cruelty, only the flat weight of a man who had watched this arithmetic kill people. "You need 6 cords minimum. Hardwood. Stacked and covered. You need that chimney relined. You need the wall seams packed with fresh mud and straw before the first hard freeze sets them permanent. And you need all of it done in the next 8 weeks. "I understand," Clara said. "Do you?" He put his hat back on. "Because what I see is a woman with $20-some and pride enough to stay when staying is not the brave choice. You can freeze by morning all the same as a fool, and if those girls wait cold, it will be on your pride." He left the way he had come. Clara watched him ride east until the flatness swallowed him, and there was nothing to see but grass and the memory of what he had said. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the table after the girls were down and wrote the numbers on a piece of brown paper. 6 cords at winter prices was more than $60. She had 23. Hauling from the river timber 12 miles south required a wagon and a team she did not own. Hiring a man with both cost $4 a day, and 6 cords meant at least 10 days of cutting and hauling. She could not cut it herself in time. She could not buy it. She could not borrow enough to cover the gap. And she could not leave. She had no family within 300 miles willing to take in a divorced woman with 2 children. Passage east cost money she did not have. Abandoning the claim meant losing the only asset she possessed. There was no door-marked exit in any direction. Clara folded the paper and sat with her hands flat on the table in the dark. The stove ticked as it cooled. By midnight, the room was cold enough to see her breath. The idea did not come as a flash. It came as a broken thing. 3 days after Rourke's visit, Clara was repairing a patch on the bake oven behind the house, a squat clay and brick structure Martin had built poorly, and she had maintained worse. The mortar along one seam had cracked through the summer heat, and she was pulling out the failed section to repack it. The oven had not been fired in 2 days. When she pulled the 3rd brick free, warmth pressed against her palm. She stopped, held her hand flat against the exposed interior. The bricks were warm, not hot. The fire had been dead since Sunday, but warm, measurably, undeniably warmer than the September air around her. She sat back on her heels and looked at the oven as though seeing it for the first time. The iron stove inside the house threw heat like a bonfire and went cold like one too. But this crude oven, built of clay and brick and packed earth, held warmth the way a stone holds the memory of afternoon sun. Slowly, deeply, without drama. Her father's voice arrived before the memory did. She was 8 years old, standing in his shop in Iowa while he set bricks around a bake oven he was building for a neighbor. He had pressed her hand against the warm masonry the way a teacher presses a student's finger to a word on a page. "Feel that," he had said. "Iron throws heat fast. Brick keeps it after the flames are gone. A good mason does not build a bigger fire. He builds a better box." Clara had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. Now, kneeling beside a broken oven with dry clay under her fingernails and the mineral smell of wetted brick in her nose, the lesson returned with the force of something urgent. Iron radiates fast and dies fast. Masonry heats slowly, but stores warmth. Every settler she knew thought about heat in terms of fire, bigger fires, more wood, hotter stoves. But her father had thought about heat in terms of mass, not how much you burned, but how much the walls remembered. Over the next week, Clara read everything she could find. An old stove almanac from the mercantile's discard pile, a county agricultural circular that mentioned European settlers building tile stoves with internal channels, a half-remembered conversation with a woman in Iowa who had described her grandmother's German Kachelofen, a stove made of ceramic tiles that you fired once and that kept a room warm all day. The principle was the same in every source. Hot gases from a fire contain enormous heat. In a cast iron stove, those gases race up the chimney and carry most of their warmth out of the house. But if you force the smoke to travel a longer path through channels inside heavy masonry, the mass absorbed the heat before the gases escaped. The fire could be small and fast. The mass did the work of keeping the room warm. Clara drew the design on a piece of sackcloth with a stick of charcoal, a compact firebox built of firebrick and lined with clay, a throat that channeled smoke downward first, against its natural inclination, then laterally through a long bench made of packed earth, sand, and clay, then up to the chimney. The bench would be roughly 18 feet long, 30 inches high, and 34 inches deep. The internal flue run would stretch nearly 20 feet. Every foot of that run was another foot of mass-absorbing heat that would otherwise vanish up the chimney. The gamble was this: if she could make the draft work, if the smoke would consent to travel down and then sideways before rising, she could heat her house with twists of willow, sagebrush, corn cobs, and twig bundles. The fast, hot burns that masonry demanded were exactly the kind of fuel she could actually gather. She did not need 6 cords of oak. She needed armfuls of brush, but the risk was equally clear. Downdraft was unforgiving. If the chimney did not draw hard enough, smoke would fill the room. If the flue joints leaked, carbon would seep into the sleeping space. If the clay cracked under thermal stress, the whole bench became a useless pile of mud in the middle of her only room, and she would have torn out the iron stove, her only proven heat source, to build something that might poison her children. Nettie Corse was the first to say it aloud. Nettie lived 4 miles northwest, the closest neighbor with a working household. She was not a cruel woman. She brought eggs when she visited and always asked after the girls. But she was practical down to her boot soles, and when she saw Clara's charcoal drawing spread across the table, she asked the question that anyone with sense would ask. "Even if the bench warms," Nettie said, tracing the flue path with one finger, "what happens when the smoke refuses the downward turn and fills the room?" "It will not refuse," Clara said. "Once the chimney column is hot, the draw pulls harder than the smoke can resist. The heat rises in the vertical section and creates a vacuum that forces the horizontal path. And if the chimney is cold, if the wind caps it, if the clay cracks and you lose the seal?" Clara did not have a complete answer for every question. She had a principle and a drawing and the memory of warm bricks under her hand. What she said was, "I will build a test channel outside. If the smoke draws, I build the bench. If it does not, I have lost nothing but time." "Time," Nettie said, "is the one thing you cannot afford to lose." She was right. It was already late September. The first hard freeze could arrive in 6 weeks. And Clara was proposing to tear out her only working stove to build something she had never attempted with materials she had not yet gathered, using skills she had learned from memory and almanacs. The test channel took 2 days. Clara laid a short run of salvaged pipe inside a mound of clay and packed earth behind the house, with a small firebox at one end and a vertical rise at the other. She lit a fire of twisted willow bark and watched the smoke. It hesitated. For a long, terrible moment, it curled back toward the opening. Then the chimney column warmed, the draw caught, and the smoke turned, pulled sideways through the horizontal run, and exited clean. Clara held a damp hand near every joint. She felt no leak. She held a candle flame near the firebox opening and watched it bend inward, sucked by the draft. The principle worked. Now she had to build the real thing before the planes decided she had run out of time. Word travels on flat land the way sound travels across water, farther and faster than it should. Within a week, half the scattered claims along the Little Blue knew that the divorced Hale woman was tearing out her cast iron stove and replacing it with a bench made of mud. Silas Pruitt heard about it at the grain elevator in town and laughed loud enough that the clerk repeated the laugh to 3 other customers before noon. Silas was 46, thick through the shoulders, and owned the only reliable wood hauling operation between the river timber and the rail stop. Every winter, when homesteaders realized they were short on fuel, Silas was the man they came to. He charged $4 a cord delivered, fair in October, punishing by December, and the only option for anyone who had not planned far enough ahead. His business model depended on desperation, and he had built a comfortable life on the certainty that the plains would always produce desperate people. A woman who claimed she could heat a house with brush and twigs was not a curiosity to Silas. She was a threat. He found Clara at the Mercantile on a Saturday. She was purchasing firebrick, 8 pieces at 12 cents each, nearly $1 she could not afford to waste. She was also buying a small sack of tight sand and a pail of po-white clayite additive the storekeep had ordered for a chimney repair that never happened. Silas leaned against the counter and watched her count coins. "I hear you're building yourself a mud stove," he said. Clara did not look up. "I'm building a heating bench. Out of dirt. Out of firebrick, clay, sand, and salvage pipe. And you tore out the iron to do it. The iron ate fuel I cannot supply." Silas smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he's watching someone drown and knows he sells rope. "Mrs. Hale, I have hauled wood to every claim on this stretch for 11 years. I have seen men with full teams and good axes come up short by February. You have no team. You have no axe worth the name. And now you have no stove." He leaned closer. "When the cold comes, and it will come, you will need real wood, and you will pay what real wood costs. I appreciate your concern for my fuel supply, Mr. Pruitt. It is not concern, it is arithmetic. The same arithmetic Mr. Rourke did when he walked your property and told you the truth. You are too proud to buy proper wood, and your girls will pay the price for it." Clara picked up her purchases. Her hands were steady. "Good day, Mr. Pruitt." She walked out. Silas watched her go, then turned to the storekeeper and said, loud enough for the 2 women browsing dry goods to hear, "She tore out the only real stove in that house and laid herself a grave of mud. When those children are shivering in December, remember who tried to tell her." The words reached Nettie by Tuesday. They reached Elias Rourke by Thursday. They reached Clara by way of Ruth, who came home from a visit to the nearest schoolhouse and asked her mother why Mrs. Farber had said they were going to freeze. Clara knelt in front of her daughter and took both her hands. "We are not going to freeze," she said. "I am building something that will keep us warm, but I need you to trust me the way I trusted my father when he taught me about bricks." Ruth searched her mother's face. "Did grandfather's bricks work?" "Every time." Ruth nodded. She did not ask again. That night, Clara lay awake and felt the doubt that Rourke and Silas and Nettie had planted press against her chest like a physical weight. The iron stove was already out. The firebox foundation was half dug. She had spent nearly $4 on materials she could not return. If she was wrong, if the draft failed at scale, if the clay cracked, if the bench could not hold enough heat, she would have no stove, no money, and no time to fix it. The wind pressed against the sod walls. October was coming. She could smell it in the dryness of the grass and feel it in the way the darkness arrived 10 minutes earlier each evening. She got up before dawn and began mixing clay. The first 3 days were demolition and preparation. Clara pulled the iron stove from its platform, scraping her knuckles raw on the rusted bolts that held the legs to the floor brackets. The stove weighed more than she expected. She dragged it outside with a rope looped through the firebox door, leaving gouges in the packed earth floor. Without the stove, the room felt larger and colder and terrifyingly empty. She reinforced the floor where the bench would sit. Flat field stones carried from the creek bed a quarter-mile south, tamped earth between them, a level surface checked with a plank edge and a cup of water. The girls helped carry stones. Eliza treated it as a game. Ruth watched her mother's face and carried without being asked. Day 4, Clara began the firebox. 8 firebricks formed the combustion chamber, a box roughly 14 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 16 inches tall. She mortared the joints with a clay sand mix her father would have recognized. 2 parts clay, 1 part coarse sand, a handful of chopped straw for binding. The throat of the firebox, the opening where smoke would begin its downward journey, needed to be smooth and tight. Any rough edge would create turbulence. Turbulence killed draft. She worked with her hands because she had no proper trowel. By the end of the 4th day, her fingertips were cracked and her wrists ached from the repetitive smoothing motion. The firebox stood on its stone platform like a small altar, open-throated and waiting. The stovepipe came next. She had 3 lengths of salvaged pipe from Martin's old chimney setup, and 2 more she bought from a farmer selling out 12 miles east, a $5 expense that left her with $14 and a growing debt at the mercantile. The pipes needed to form the path, down from the firebox throat, lateral through the bench body, then up to the chimney exit. Every joint had to be sealed. Every angle had to be gradual enough that smoke would follow without complaint. On the 6th day, the temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight. Clara woke to frost on the inside of the window glass. The room without its stove felt like a cellar. She heated water over a fire pit outside and brought it in for the girls to wash. Ruth said nothing. Eliza cried because the water was only lukewarm and her hands were cold. Clara worked faster. She had no choice. By day 8, the firebox was set and the first pipe lengths were laid into the bench mold, a wooden frame she had built from scrap lumber to hold the shape while she packed earth around the pipes. The bench ran along the south wall of the room, roughly 18 feet from the firebox end to the chimney end. She packed clay and sand around the pipe in layers, each layer tamped and smoothed, each layer checked for gaps. A leak anywhere in the run would mean smoke in the room. Smoke in the room with 2 sleeping children was not a risk. It was a verdict. Her back seized on the 9th day. She had been bending over the bench form for 6 hours straight, packing clay with both hands, and when she tried to stand, the muscles along her spine locked. She sat on the floor and breathed through her teeth until the spasm passed. Then she stood up and kept packing. If you have ever been told that what you were building was foolish by someone who did not understand what you were fighting for, tell us in the comments. Because what Clara was building was about to face its first real test, and the people who doubted her were not finished talking. The setback arrived on day 11. She lit a low fire in the firebox to begin drying the clay around the first pipe section. The heat was gentle, willow twists, not a roaring blaze, but the moisture in the fresh clay turned to steam faster than she expected. A crack opened along the top of the bench near the second pipe joint, not wide, maybe the width of a fingernail. But Clara stared at it the way a sailor stares at water coming through a hull. She let the fire die. She waited for the bench to cool. She mixed a fresh batch of clay with more chopped straw, finer straw this time, cut with scissors into pieces no longer than her thumb, and packed the crack until it disappeared. Then she fired again, lower and slower, and watched. The crack did not return, but a new one opened 6 inches away. Clara sat on the floor with clay on her hands and straw in her hair and closed her eyes. Rourke's voice was in her head, Silas's voice, Nettie's careful, honest doubt. She had torn out her stove. She had spent money she could not recover, and the bench was cracking. Outside, the October wind had an edge to it that had not been there a week before. The grass had gone from gold to gray. Somewhere south, the timber she could not reach stood thick and seasoned and useless to her. She opened her eyes. She looked at the crack. She thought about what her father would say about a clay mix that split under gentle heat. Too much clay, not enough sand. The ratio was wrong. She scraped out the section around the crack, remixed at a higher sand proportion, closer to 1:1, and repacked. This time she dried it with the door open and the fire barely more than embers, letting the moisture leave slowly over 2 days rather than forcing it out in hours. The new mix held. No crack, no seam. The clay dried smooth and tight around the pipe, and when Clara pressed her palm against it after the test fire, she felt warmth moving through the mass the way heat moves through a sun-baked stone wall, slow, deep, and steady. $14 remained. The chimney tie-in was not finished. The bench was only half packed. October was dissolving into the first gray days of November, and every morning the frost inside the window glass was thicker than the morning before. Clara was running out of everything except reasons to keep going. She met Johann Adler on a Wednesday, though she would not learn his full name until the following day. Clara had walked the 4 miles to the mercantile to buy sand, coarse river sand, the kind that held its grain when mixed with clay and did not powder under heat. The storekeeper had a partial sack behind the counter, but it was fine-grained sand meant for mortar, and Clara knew from 2 weeks of trial that fine sand let clay shrink and split. She needed coarse. The storekeeper did not carry it. She was standing outside the mercantile, calculating whether she could haul creek-bed sand 4 miles in pails without losing a full day of construction, when a voice behind her said, "That sand will crack on you." She turned. The man was 54 or 55, broad through the chest but leaning hard on a stick cut from a cottonwood branch. His left boot was unlaced, and through the gap she could see linen wrapping around a foot swollen to twice its proper size. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, and stained with the particular gray that comes from years of working with calcium and a tight ash. "I know," Clara said. "I need coarse grain." "You need river sand screened through a 1/4-inch mesh. Creek sand has too much silt. You mix it 1:1 with your clay?" "I tried 2:1. It cracked. I moved to 1:1 and it held." The man studied her, not her face, her hands. He looked at the clay packed under her fingernails and the raw patches on her palms where she had been smoothing surfaces for 2 weeks. Whatever he saw there changed something in his expression. 1:1 is close," he said. "But you want closer to 3 sand, 2 clay, and a 1/4 measure of chopped straw no longer than your first finger joint. The straw burns out during curing and leaves air channels that stop the thermal shock from propagating. What are you building?" "A heating bench. Firebrick firebox. Downdraft flue through an earthen mass, chimney exit." His eyebrows rose, not with amusement, with recognition. "You have drawn this out?" "On sackcloth, with charcoal." "Show me." His name was Johann Adler, though everyone on the plains called him Hans. He was German-born, from a village near Koblenz, and he had spent 26 years as a railroad mason, setting bridge footings, lining kiln walls, rebuilding brick chimneys in depots from Omaha to Cheyenne. 3 months earlier, a rail car had rolled across his left foot and crushed 2 metatarsal bones. The railroad paid him nothing. He had drifted to the nearest settlement doing intermittent chimney and kiln repair for anyone who would feed him while his foot healed. It was not healing well. He came to Clara's claim the next morning. She unrolled the sackcloth drawing on the table and weighted the corners with stones. Hans looked at it for a long time without speaking. He traced the flue path with one thick finger, down from the firebox throat, lateral through the bench, up to the chimney. He measured distances with his hand span. He counted pipe joints. Then he said, "Your throat is too sharp." "What do you mean?" "Here." He pointed to the transition between the firebox and the downward run. "You have drawn a 90-degree turn. Smoke does not like corners. Every sharp turn costs you draft. If the wind is wrong and the chimney is cold, this corner is where the smoke will stall and push back into the room." "What angle does it need?" "Think of a river bend. Not a cliff, not a wall, a curve. You want the smoke to be guided downward, not forced. 45 degrees at most. And the inside of the curve must be smooth. No ridges, no mortar lips, no rough clay. Smooth as the inside of a pipe." He picked up Clara's charcoal stick and redrew the throat on the sackcloth. The line was confident. It was the line of a man who had built flue paths the way other men built fences by the hundred, until the knowledge lived in his hands rather than his memory. Clara looked at the revised drawing and understood, with the certainty of someone who has been working a problem for weeks, that she could not have found this angle on her own. Not in time. Hans did not offer charity. He offered trade. He would teach her the techniques, the clay ratios, the throat geometry, the testing methods. And in exchange she would feed him 1 meal a day and let him sleep in the lean-to behind the house until his foot allowed travel. Clara agreed. They shook hands, and his grip was careful around her blistered fingers. The work changed immediately. Hans taught through action, not lecture. On the first day, he sat on an overturned bucket beside the bench form. His foot would not allow him to kneel, and showed Clara how to test for leaks before firing. He lit a candle and held it near every joint in the pipe run. Where the flame bent inward, the seal was good. Where it stood still or flickered outward, air was escaping. "Smoke follows the path of least resistance," he said. "If there is a leak in the bench, the smoke will find it before you do, and it will find it at 2 in the morning when the children are asleep and cannot smell it." Clara sealed 3 joints that afternoon. Each one required scraping out the old clay, remixing with Hans's ratio, 3 parts sand, 2 parts clay, a quarter measure of fine chopped straw, and packing it smooth with a wet thumb. The work was slow. Her hands cramped. Hans watched and corrected without impatience. On the 3rd day of their partnership, he taught her the damp hand test. Hold your palm near a warm surface and feel for the draft's pull. If air moves against your skin, the flue is drawing. If the air is still, something is blocked. If the air pushes outward, you have a leak that will kill someone before spring. "Your father was a stove setter?" Hans asked while Clara packed clay around the 6th pipe joint. "A wagon mason, but he set stoves and bake ovens as side work. He understood brick." "He understood thermal mass," Hans corrected. "Most people do not. Most people think heat comes from fire. Heat comes from mass. Fire is just the delivery method. The mass is the bank. You deposit heat into it, and it pays you back for hours." Eliza wandered over and watched Hans shape a clay plug with his thick fingers. "Are you fixing our house?" she asked. "Your mother is fixing your house," Hans said. "I am fixing her corners." October burned away. The cottonwood leaves along the creek turned yellow, then brown, then were gone. Night temperatures dropped below freezing regularly by the 3rd week. Clara worked from first light to last, mixing clay in the morning when her hands were strongest, and packing it through the afternoon when the sun warmed the material enough to stay workable. Hans directed from his bucket, standing only when a joint required his hands, the critical ones, the ones where the pipe changed direction and the seal had to be perfect. Progress markers told the story in numbers Clara tracked on the back of the sackcloth drawing. Day 15. Firebox complete, throat revised to Hans's curve, first 4 pipe lengths sealed and tested. Day 18. Bench packed to the midpoint. 9 feet of the 18-foot run enclosed in clay and earth. The mass was already heavy enough that the floor stones beneath it groaned when Clara leaned against the form. Day 21. A cold rain hit that lasted 2 days. The exposed clay on the unfinished section absorbed water and softened. Clara covered it with wagon sheet canvas, salvaged from a scrap Martin had left behind, and waited. 2 days lost. She could not afford 2 days. Day 23. The bench was packed to 14 feet. 4 feet remained, plus the chimney tie-in. Hans's foot was worse. He had been standing more than he should, and the swelling had turned a color Clara did not like. She told him to rest. He told her the chimney junction was the most important joint in the entire system, and he would rest when it was set. They argued about it. It was their first real disagreement, and it cut along a line that would define their partnership. Clara wanted to protect him, and Hans wanted to protect the build. He won because he was right. A poor chimney junction would leak draft and ruin everything. Clara could not set it alone. She did not yet have the feel for how tightly the vertical rise needed to meet the horizontal run. The chimney is where gravity and heat fight each other, Hans said, sitting on his bucket while Clara held the pipe section in place. Hot air wants to rise. Your flue path forces it sideways first. At the chimney, you're asking it to finally do what it has wanted to do all along. If the junction is rough, the turbulence will steal your draft. If it is smooth, the rising column will pull the entire horizontal run clean. Clara held the pipe steady while Hans packed the junction with his hands. His fingers found the seam by touch, smoothing clay around the pipe's circumference in one continuous motion. When he was done, he held a candle to the joint, and the flame bent inward so sharply it nearly went out. "Good," he said. "Now cure it slowly. 3 days of low fires. Do not rush it." On the 26th day, October 31st, the bench was complete. Clara stood back and looked at it. It ran the full length of the south wall, 18 feet of packed earth, clay, and sand, 30 inches high and 34 inches deep, with a compact firebrick firebox at one end and a chimney rise at the other. Inside, the pipe carried smoke through roughly 20 feet of mass before releasing it. The surface was smooth enough to sleep on. The joints were sealed. The throat curved the way Hans had drawn it. It was the ugliest and most important thing Clara had ever built. Nettie came that afternoon. She had not visited in 2 weeks. The rain had made the 4-mile walk difficult, and the gossip had made it awkward. But she came now, carrying a bundle of old horsehair plaster and a jar of boiled linseed oil. "For the surface cracks," she said, handing Clara the bundle. "My grandmother used horsehair in her plaster back in Ohio. It binds better than straw for the outer coat." Clara took the bundle. "Thank you." Nettie looked at the bench. She ran her hand along the surface the way she might touch an animal she was not sure was tame. "It is bigger than I imagined. 18 feet. And the smoke goes through it? All the way through? Down from the firebox, through the bench, up and out the chimney." Nettie pressed her lips together. She was still not convinced, but she stayed for 2 hours and helped Clara apply the horsehair plaster to the surface seams while Hans directed from his bucket. When she left, she said, "I hope you're right, Clara. I truly do." Elias Rourke returned on November 8th. He did not announce himself. Clara heard hooves and came to the door to find him dismounting with the stiff care of a man whose joints had begun to betray him. He tied the gelding and walked inside without asking. He looked at the bench the way he had looked at the room 2 months earlier, clinically, without warmth or hostility. He touched the surface. He crouched, painfully, and examined the firebox. He held his hand near the chimney junction. "You tore out the iron," he said. "Yes." "And built this instead?" "Yes." "On whose advice?" My own, with help from Mr. Adler. Rourke straightened. He looked at Hans, who sat on his bucket with his bad foot propped on a stone. You are a mason? Railroad mason, 26 years. Rourke turned back to Clara. The principle is sound. I've seen masonry stoves in German settlements east of here. They work, but they are built by masons, with proper tools, over weeks or months. This was built in 26 days, Clara said, by a woman with a charcoal drawing and a man who cannot stand. Something moved behind Rourke's eyes. Not approval, not yet, but the recognition that the thing he was looking at was not madness. It was calculation. The room feels steadier than before, he admitted. But a mild November day tells you nothing. The test is January. The test is always January. He left without saying goodbye, but he did not repeat his warning about pride. November passed. The bench held. Clara fired it daily, short, hot burns of willow bundles, corn cobs, and sagebrush twists. Each firing lasted less than an hour. The flames raced through the dry fuel, and the heat poured into the throat, down through the pipe run, and into the mass. Within 2 hours of the fire dying, the bench surface was warm enough to press your back against. By evening, the warmth had penetrated deep into the clay. By morning, the room was still livable. The iron stove had demanded constant feeding through the night. Clara had woken 3 or 4 times each winter night in previous years to stuff wood into its belly, and by dawn the room was cold anyway, because the metal shed heat as fast as it absorbed it. The bench was different. The bench remembered. Hans measured the results the only way available to them, by feel and by comparison. He placed a cup of water on the bench surface at sundown and checked it at dawn. It never froze. He placed a second cup on the floor across the room. It froze on 3 of the first 7 nights. The difference was the bench, but the real numbers were in the fuel. Clara kept careful count. In 1 week, she burned roughly a quarter cord of mixed brush, willow, sagebrush, corn cobs, dried grass twists. A quarter cord of brush was what she could gather in 2 hard days of walking and cutting. A quarter cord of hardwood from Silas Pruitt cost $1. Clara's fuel cost was measured in blisters and hours, not dollars. The math was changing. Slowly, but it was changing. Hans warned her not to trust it yet. Mild weather lies, he said. Your bench is warm because November has been gentle. When the real cold clamps down, when the wind drives horizontal and the chimney cap ices, that is when you learn whether the draft holds. Do not celebrate a warm bench in November. Celebrate it in January. The cow failed on November 22nd. Clara found her lying on her side in the byre, breathing in shallow gasps, her udder dry. She died 2 days later. Clara butchered what meat she could save and packed it in snow behind the house. 1 fewer mouth to feed, 1 fewer source of milk. Eliza did not understand and kept asking when the cow would get better. Ruth understood and said nothing. The girls developed coughs in early December. Nothing severe, the dry air and the wood smoke and the cold that crept through the wall seams despite Clara's patching. But a cough in a child on the plains in winter was not a minor thing. It was a message from a body that had less margin than it needed. Clara gathered fuel obsessively. She walked 3 miles to cut willow along the creek and carried it back in bundles on her shoulders. She stripped sagebrush from the flat south of the claim. She collected corn cobs from a neighbor's waste pile and dried them in rows behind the house. The fuel shed, really just a lean-to with canvas walls, filled slowly, not with the reassuring bulk of stacked cordwood, but with loose, light bundles that looked like nothing and burned like furnaces. The sky changed in late December. The high, thin clouds of autumn were replaced by a low gray ceiling that pressed against the horizon like a lid. Shallow snow covered the ground. The wind acquired a sound Clara had not heard before, a sustained moan that did not rise or fall, but simply continued hour after hour, as though the plains themselves were exhaling. Rumors arrived with the wind. A family 60 miles north had lost 2 children to exposure when their stove went out during a 3-day blow. A freight line had suspended service between Hastings and Red Cloud. A man at the rail stop said the old-timers were watching the sky the way animals watch it, with attention that did not seem voluntary. Hans said little during these weeks. His foot had stabilized but not improved, and the cold made the swelling worse. He spent most of his time inside near the bench, sketching refinements on scraps of paper, a wider clean-out hatch for the firebox, a way to add thermal mass above the sleeping section, a cook plate that could be set into the bench surface above the hottest pipe section. Clara studied the sketches and filed them away. Improvements for later, if there was a later. On January 10th, 1888, the temperature was 34 degrees above zero, mild enough that Clara washed clothes outside and hung them on the line. Ruth played in the thin snow. Eliza sat on the bench inside and drew pictures on slate. The sun was out. The wind was quiet. It felt for one deceiving afternoon like the winter might be gentle. Hans stood in the doorway and watched the sky. "The barometer is wrong," he said. "What do you mean?" "The air feels too light. When pressure drops this fast and the temperature stays warm, the balance is false. Something is building." Clara looked at the sky. It was clear and blue and empty. "Gather fuel," Hans said, "as much as you can carry. Today." She did not argue. She had learned to trust his instincts the way she trusted her father's lessons, not because he explained them, but because his hands knew things his words could not always reach. She spent the afternoon hauling willow bundles from the lean-to and stacking them beside the firebox. She brought 4 armfuls of sagebrush inside and piled them against the wall. She filled 2 pails with corn cobs and dried grass twists and set them where she could reach them in the dark. By sunset on January 11th, Clara had enough fuel inside the house for roughly 3 days of continuous firing. It was not enough if the crisis lasted longer, but it was what she had. The morning of January 12th dawned mild and bright. The temperature at noon on January 12th, 1888, was somewhere above 40 degrees. Clara knew this because she stepped outside without a coat and felt comfortable. Ruth was at the neighboring schoolhouse 3 miles east. Too far, Clara would later think. Too far for a mild day that everyone trusted. Eliza was inside, coughing again, lying on quilts spread across the bench surface that radiated steady warmth from the morning's fire. Hans was in the lean-to, wrapping his foot with fresh linen. He had planned to walk to town the next day to see whether a doctor had passed through. His foot needed attention that Clara's field care could not provide. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Clara was hauling water from the well when she noticed the wind shift. It did not change direction gradually. It swung. One moment the air was moving gently from the south. The next, it came from the northwest, and the temperature on her exposed skin dropped so fast she thought she had stepped into shade. She looked north. The horizon, which had been clear all morning, was gone. In its place was a wall, not a cloud. A wall. A solid, moving line of white and gray that stretched from east to west without a break, boiling forward across the flatland with a speed that made Clara's stomach clench. She dropped the water bucket and ran. Inside the house, she slammed the door and wedged it shut with the stone and a chair. Eliza sat up on the bench, startled. "Mama?" "Stay on the bench. Do not move." Clara lit the firebox. Her hands shook, but she had done this 100 times in the last 3 months, and the motions were automatic. Twisted willow bark for kindling, corn cobs stacked in a pyramid, a match struck against the firebrick. The flame caught. She fed it sagebrush twists until the fire was hot and fast, and the throat began to draw. The wall hit the house at approximately 1:30. The sound was not wind, it was freight. It was the sound of a locomotive made of ice and air slamming into the sod walls at 50 miles an hour. The door shuddered. The window glass, already cracked from the settling frame, splintered inward along the fracture line. Cold air poured through the gap like water through a broken levee. Clara stuffed a blanket into the window frame and held it with her body while the wind tried to tear it away. The temperature inside the room dropped 15 degrees in minutes, 20. The fire in the firebox roared. The draft was pulling hard now, the chimney column heated and hungry. But the room was losing warmth through every seam, every crack, every gap in the board and sod walls that she had not sealed tightly enough. Eliza screamed, not from cold, from the sound. The wind had a voice. It screamed back. Hans came through the door in a burst of snow and air that lowered the room temperature another 5 degrees in the seconds the door was open. He was white from shoulders to boots. Snow was packed into his beard and his eyelashes and the folds of his coat. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. "Ruth," Clara said, "at the schoolhouse?" 3 miles east." Hans looked at the window where snow was already forcing through the gaps around the blanket. "No one is traveling 3 miles in this, not on foot, not on horseback. The visibility is gone. You cannot see 10 feet. Clara knew this. She had known it the moment the wall hit. Ruth was 3 miles away in a schoolhouse that had a potbelly stove and a teacher who might or might not have the sense to keep the children inside. Clara could not reach her. She could not send anyone. She could only stand in her own house and hold that knowledge in her chest like a piece of broken glass. "The schoolhouse has walls and a stove," Hans said. His voice was level. "The teacher will keep them inside. Ruth is a sensible child." "She's 9 years old." "She's a sensible 9-year-old, and you have one child here who needs you to keep this room warm. Do your work, Clara." She did her work. The first hour was manageable. The firebox burned hot. The draft held, and the bench began absorbing heat through the pipe run the way it had every day for the past 2 months. The room stabilized. Not warm, the wind was stealing heat through the walls faster than Clara had ever experienced, but livable. Eliza stopped crying and lay on the quilts with her knees drawn up, the bench beneath her radiating warmth into her back. The second hour brought the complication. Clara heard it before she saw it, a change in the sound of the chimney draw. The steady, low hum that indicated good draft wavered, stuttered, then stopped. Smoke curled backward from the firebox opening. "The cap," Hans said. He was sitting against the door, his bad foot extended, his face gray from the cold and the effort of crossing 30 feet of open ground in a blizzard. "Ice on the chimney cap. The exit is choking." Clara's heart struck the inside of her chest like a fist against a wall. If the chimney capped with ice, the smoke had nowhere to go. It would fill the bench, back up through the pipe run, and pour into the room through the firebox opening. The bench, her innovation, her gamble, her answer to every skeptic, would become a smoke pump filling a sealed room with 2 children and a crippled man inside it. If you're invested in what happens next, if you need to know whether that bench holds or whether everything Clara built was for nothing, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next 60 seconds in that room changed everything. Smoke thickened near the ceiling. Eliza coughed, a deep, rattling cough that was different from her winter cough, wetter and more urgent. Clara's eyes burned. The air tasted of char. "You cannot clear the cap from outside," Hans said. "You cannot open the door in this wind. You need to clear it from inside the logic." "How?" "The chimney is blocked at the top, but the vertical column still has residual heat. If you can raise the temperature in the firebox sharply, a fast hot burn, hotter than anything you have fed it today, the column will heat enough to melt the ice from below. The draft will break through." "How hot?" "As hot as you can make it. Everything you have. Feed it all at once." Clara grabbed the corn cobs. She grabbed the sagebrush twists. She grabbed the dried grass bundles and the willow bark, and she fed them into the firebox in a single, reckless load that went against everything she had learned about controlled burns and measured firing. The fuel caught. The fire in the firebox doubled in intensity, then tripled. The firebrick glowed. The heat at the throat was ferocious, and for one terrible moment more smoke poured backward into the room, because the chimney was still capped and the fire was producing gases faster than the block system could handle. Eliza was gasping. Hans had pulled his coat over his face. Clara's vision blurred from the smoke and the tears it produced. 10 seconds. 20. The smoke thickened. Clara could not see the far wall of the room. She could not see her daughter on the bench. She reached out and found Eliza's shoulder and pulled her close, covering the child's face with her apron. 30 seconds. The fire roared. The throat roared. The chimney column, sealed beneath its cap of ice, groaned with the pressure of superheated air fighting for an exit. Then the ice cracked. Clara heard it, a sharp, percussive sound like a gunshot from above the roofline. The column vented. The draft seized the room with a violence that sucked the smoke from the ceiling in a single rushing inhalation. The air cleared. The fire in the firebox settled from a roar to a steady pulling burn, and the smoke flowed down through the throat, into the bench, along the pipe run, and up through the chimney the way Hans had designed it to flow. Clara knelt on the floor with her daughter against her chest and breathed. The air tasted of clay and cold and the mineral smell of heated brick. Behind her, the bench was doing what it had always done, absorbing heat into its mass, storing it, holding it against the darkness and the cold and the wind that screamed against the walls. Hans lowered his coat from his face. His eyes were red. "Good," he said. "Now keep the fires small and steady. The mass will do the rest." She kept the fires small and steady. Through the afternoon, through the evening, through the first long night when the wind never stopped and the temperature outside dropped to something Clara could not measure and did not try to. She fed the firebox every 2 hours with a handful of fuel, willow twists, corn cobs, whatever was closest. Each firing lasted 20 minutes. The bench absorbed the heat and released it slowly, evenly, through the packed clay and earth and into the room. At midnight, Clara placed her hand flat on the bench surface. It was warm, not hot. The heat was deep in the mass, not on the skin, but warm enough that Eliza slept on it without shivering, her small body curled on quilts that were warm from below. Hans slept against the door with his coat as a blanket. Clara did not sleep. She fed the fire and listened to the wind and thought about Ruth. The second day was worse. The blizzard did not relent. Snow packed against the north wall until it reached the roofline. The window blanket froze solid, which ironically improved the seal. The temperature inside the room held, not warm by any standard a person from a city would recognize, but steadily above freezing, steady enough that water in a cup did not ice over, and breath was visible only in the corners farthest from the bench. Clara burned through half her indoor fuel supply by the second evening. She rationed what remained, smaller fires, less frequent. The bench gave back what it had stored. At dawn on the second morning, 14 hours after the last firing, the surface was still warm enough to press a hand against without flinching. The contrast arrived on the afternoon of the third day, when the wind finally dropped enough to see beyond the door. Nettie Corse appeared on foot, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, her face raw and her voice hoarse. She had burned through her entire woodpile in 36 hours. Her iron stove had gone cold at 4 in the morning of the second night. She and her husband had survived by burning furniture, a chair, then a table leg, then a shelf, and wrapping themselves in every blanket they owned. "Your stove went cold?" Clara said. "The iron does not hold heat," Nettie said. She was standing inside Clara's door, and her eyes kept moving to the bench. She placed her hand on its surface. She held it there. "This is warm. It has been warm since Tuesday." "You have been burning all that time?" "Small fires, a handful of brush every few hours. The clay holds the rest." Nettie stared at her. The doubt that had lived in her expression since September, the practical, honest, well-intentioned doubt of a woman who could not believe that mud and pipe could replace iron and oak, was gone. In its place was something Clara had not seen directed at her since before the divorce: respect. Word came on the fourth day that 3 people in the county had died. An older bachelor on a claim 8 miles north had been found frozen in his chair, his stove cold, his woodpile exhausted. 2 children from a family near the schoolhouse had been lost in the whiteout trying to walk home. They were found in a drift a quarter mile from their own door. Ruth was alive. The school teacher had kept the children inside, burned every piece of available fuel, and huddled them together under coats until the storm broke. Ruth walked home on the fourth day with frostbitten fingers and a calm that frightened Clara more than tears would have. She came through the door, looked at the bench, and lay down on it without a word. She slept for 14 hours. Clara sat beside her and placed one hand on the warm clay and the other on her daughter's hair and did not move until the light changed. The blizzard left a silence that was almost as disorienting as the noise had been. For 3 days, the wind had been a living thing inside the walls, pressing and clawing and screaming through every gap. When it stopped, the absence felt like deafness. Clara stood outside on the morning of the 5th day and listened to nothing. The snow was waist deep in the flats and chest deep where it had drifted against the north wall. The sky was pale and empty, and so cold the air hurt her teeth. The bench was still warm. She had fired it once at dawn, a small load of willow twists and dried grass, and the surface held the heat from the previous night's firing beneath it like a second pulse. Eliza sat on it, eating cornbread. Ruth lay on her stomach reading a primer Clara had borrowed from the school teacher months ago, her frostbitten fingers wrapped in linen strips. Hans was outside, leaning on his stick, examining the chimney cap. The ice had cracked clean and the cap was intact. The flue was drawing. Clara had survived. Her children had survived. Her bench had survived. None of that mattered yet to the people who had told her she would fail. Elias Rourke came on the 7th day after the storm. He did not ride this time. The snow was too deep for a horse on the open flats, and he had walked the 4 miles from the nearest passable road wearing snowshoes he had lashed together from willow and rawhide. He arrived red-faced and breathing hard, and did not remove his hat when he entered. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the bench the way a man looks at a thing he has been thinking about for days but has not yet been willing to name. He touched the surface, held his hand there, moved it 6 inches and held again, moved it a foot farther. The warmth was even, not hot at one end and cold at the other, but distributed through the mass like heat through a stone that has sat in the sun all afternoon. "When did you last fire?" he asked. 4 hours ago." "How much fuel?" A double handful of willow twists and 6 corn cobs. Rourke looked at the firebox. The coals were gray and nearly dead. He held his hand near the throat and felt the faint pull of residual draft. The course burned through 8 cords of oak in 3 days, he said. 8 cords. Nettie's husband hauled every stick of it from the river timber in November. Their stove went cold on the 2nd night. I know, Nettie came here. And the bachelor on the north claim, Mickelson, dead in his chair with 4 cords left in his shed because his stove could not burn fast enough to hold the room once the wind found the gaps. Clara said nothing. She did not need to fill the silence. The bench filled it. Rourke removed his hat. It was the first time Clara had seen him do so inside her house. I told you pride would kill them, he said. I told you those girls would wake cold because of your stubbornness. I told you that what you were building was a woman's guess at a man's trade. He paused. His jaw worked as though the next words were caught behind his teeth. It seems I did not understand what you were building. No, Clara said. You did not. The room is warmer than any room I have entered since the storm, and I have entered 11. He turned the hat in his hands. How does it work? Clara showed him. Not in a lecture, she walked him through the system the way Hans had walked her through the throat geometry. She opened the firebox and showed him the firebrick chamber. She pointed to the throat where the curve guided smoke downward. She tapped the bench surface and explained that beneath the clay, pipe carried the smoke through 20 feet of mass before releasing it up the chimney. Every foot absorbed heat. Every pound of clay stored it. The fire could be small because the mass did the remembering. Rourke listened the way she had once listened to Hans, with the attentive stillness of someone whose understanding of a subject is being rebuilt from the foundation. And the fuel, he said. Brush, willow, corn cobs. Anything that burns hot and fast. The firebox is small and the throat is tight. You want flames, not coals. The heat goes into the pipe, and the pipe puts it into the clay. The iron stove wants coals, slow burn, big wood. And it loses the heat through the metal and up the chimney before the room can hold it. This is the opposite, fast fire, slow release. Rourke put his hat back on. At the door, he turned. I will be sending people to see this. Send them. He left. His snowshoe tracks led east across the white flats, and Clara watched them until the distance swallowed him the way it swallowed everything on the plains. They came within the week. The first was a young man named Greer, 24, who had homesteaded a quarter section 6 miles south and had survived the blizzard by burning his own fence posts. His stove was intact, but his woodpile was gone, and the next storm, whenever it came, would find him with nothing. He stood inside Clara's house and touched the bench and asked 3 questions: what it cost, how long it took, and whether she would show him how. Clara answered all 3. It cost approximately $12 in firebrick, pipe, and purchased materials. It took 26 days. And yes, she would show him. The second was a woman named Dorothea Lang, no relation to anyone famous, just a German immigrant's daughter with 4 children and a husband who had gone to the railhead for work in November and had not returned. She had spent the blizzard in a sod house with a stove that consumed her entire fuel reserve in 40 hours. She had burned dried buffalo chips to keep the children alive the 3rd day, and the smell had soaked into the sod walls so deeply she said she could still taste it. Dorothea did not ask about cost. She asked about the clay. Where do I dig it? She said. How deep? What color tells me it's right? Clara took her outside and showed her the clay bank along the creek where she had gathered her own material. She showed her how to test it by rolling a piece between her palms. Good clay held together without cracking. She showed her the sand-to-clay ratio and the straw-cutting technique and the way to test a joint with a candle flame. Dorothea listened with the intensity of a woman for whom this information was not interesting but necessary. When she left, she carried a piece of sackcloth on which Clara had drawn the firebox dimensions and the flue path in charcoal, the same drawing her father's lesson had made possible, the same drawing Hans had corrected. By the end of January, 4 families had visited Clara's house to see the bench. By mid-February, the number was 7. Each visit followed a pattern. Doubt at the door, touch on the surface, questions about fuel, and a long silence during which the visitor compared what they were feeling with what they had been told was impossible. Clara showed every one of them the same thing. She did not charge for her time. She did not hoard the technique. She drew flue paths on sackcloth and cut them free for people to carry home. She mixed sample batches of clay and sand so visitors could feel the correct consistency. She answered every question with the patience of a woman who had heard worse from Silas Pruitt and survived worse from the sky. Hans watched from his bucket. His foot was marginally better. The swelling had receded enough that he could stand for an hour at a stretch, but he spent most of his time sketching refinements. A wider clean-out hatch that could be opened to remove ash from the pipe, run without dismantling the bench. A cook plate set into the surface above the hottest pipe section, where a pot of soup or wash water could sit and warm without a separate fire. A way to add a second layer of mass, packed earth on top of the bench, that would extend the heat release window from 12 hours to nearly 20. "You're building a better design while I am still teaching the first one," Clara said. "You are teaching the principle," Hans said. "The principle does not change. The design improves. And if the design changes after people have already built the first version, then they improve it. That is how masonry works. That is how everything works. You build, you learn, you build again. The woman who builds the 10th bench will build a better bench than you built, because she will have your mistakes to learn from and her own to make." It was the clearest statement of his philosophy Clara had heard, and it stayed with her longer than any of his technical lessons. Silas Pruitt did not visit Clara's house. He did not need to. The information reached him through the same network that carried all information on the plains, through wives who talked at the mercantile, through men who compared notes at the grain elevator, through children who repeated what their parents said at supper. What Silas heard was this: Clara Hale's mud bench had outlasted 8 cord wood piles. Clara Hale was teaching people to heat their houses with brush and scraps. Clara Hale was giving away the method for free. Each fact was a cut to Silas's livelihood. His business had been built on winter desperation, on the certainty that every homesteader would eventually need more wood than they had and would pay whatever Silas charged to get it. A family that could heat a house with willow twists did not need Silas. A family that could store heat in clay did not need to stack 6 cords of oak. And a woman teaching other families to do the same was not merely an annoyance. She was an extinction event for his pricing model. His first response was not conversion, it was commerce. In the 3rd week of February, Clara learned from the storekeeper that Silas had been selling stovepipe, salvaged sections from old chimneys, and surplus lengths from the railhead, at double the normal rate to anyone who mentioned Clara's bench. He was buying the pipe at standard price and marking it up, counting on the fact that demand for pipe had suddenly increased and supply had not. His second response was reputation. He told anyone who would listen that the bench was unsafe, that the smoke would leak, that the clay would crack in a hard freeze and fill the house with fumes, that Clara was not a mason and had no business teaching people to build something that could kill them in their sleep. He said it at the mercantile. He said it at the grain elevator. He said it to Elias Rourke, who listened politely and said nothing. Clara learned about the safety campaign from Nettie, who had heard it from her husband, who had heard it from Silas directly. He says the joints will fail, Nettie reported. He says a woman who learned masonry in 6 weeks cannot build something a trained mason would trust. Hans is a trained mason, Clara said. He trusts it. Silas does not mention Hans. He mentions you, a divorced woman with no training who tore out a working stove and replaced it with dirt. Clara's jaw tightened. The stove was not working. It was burning fuel I could not supply. What Silas calls a working stove is a stove that works for Silas. The accusation stung because it found the edge of a real fear. Clara was not a mason. She had learned the technique in weeks, not years, and while the bench had performed perfectly through the blizzard, through the weeks of cold that followed, through daily firing and nightly storage, she could not guarantee that every bench built by every person she taught would perform the same way. A poor clay mix, a leaking joint, a badly angled throat, any of these could produce the failure Silas was predicting. The difference was that Clara's response to the risk was education, and Silas's response was fear. She began visiting the builds. Greer's bench was the first, a simpler version, shorter at 12 feet, with only one direction change in the flue path. Clara inspected every joint. She tested every seal with a candle flame. She found one leak at the chimney junction and showed Greer how to repack it. The bench worked. Greer burned sagebrush and slept warm. Dorothea's build was the second. Hers was more ambitious, 16 feet, with a cookplate Hans had helped her plan. Clara found the clay ratio slightly too rich and helped Dorothea sand it down and repack. The bench worked. Dorothea heated wash water on the surface and fed 4 children through the coldest week of February without buying a single cord from Silas. Each successful build was a small defeat for Silas's argument. Each inspection Clara performed was evidence that her method included accountability, not just instruction. She was not handing people a drawing and walking away. She was teaching, checking, correcting, and standing behind the work. But Silas was not finished. Hans died on March 9th, 1888. The end was not dramatic. It was the end that comes to men whose bodies have been damaged in ways that do not heal on the frontier, where doctors are scarce and medicine is faith dressed in different clothes. His foot, crushed 3 months before Clara met him, had never properly mended. The bone fragments that the railroad surgeon should have removed were still inside, and the infection that Clara had watched him fight all winter finally found its way into his blood. He was lucid until the last 2 days. On the 7th of March, he sat on his bucket beside the firebox and sketched a refinement to the chimney junction, a tapered collar that would reduce turbulence at the transition between horizontal and vertical flow. His hand shook, but the lines were precise. "This will give you 8% better draw in high wind," he said. "The taper accelerates the gas as it enters the column. You will feel the difference on days when the cap wants to ice." "Hans, write it down. This one matters." Clara wrote it down. She wrote down everything he said in those last clear days. The collar design, the optimal firing temperature for curing new clay, the trick of laying a thin sand bed beneath the pipe run so the metal could expand without cracking the clay around it. She wrote it on sackcloth and on brown paper, and on the margins of the stove almanac she had taken from the mercantile's discard pile months ago. On the 8th, he could not sit up. Clara moved him onto the bench, the warmest place in the house, the place where her daughter slept, the thing he had taught her to build, and covered him with quilts. Eliza brought him water. Ruth sat beside him and read from the primer in a voice that did not waver. He died before dawn on the 9th. Clara was beside him. The fire in the firebox had burned down to coals, and the bench beneath his body was warm. She buried him behind the house. In ground she had to break with a mattock, because the frost went 18 inches deep. The grave took her most of a day. No one helped. No one knew yet. That evening, she sat at the table with the sackcloth drawings spread before her, and the charcoal stick in her hand, and the empty space in the room where his bucket had been. The fire ticked in the firebox. The bench gave off its steady, stored warmth. Outside, the March wind carried the first faint smell of thaw beneath the cold, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called and received no answer. She picked up the charcoal stick and drew the tapered collar Hans had described. Her hand was steady. The lines were not as precise as his, but they were correct. She had learned enough to know when a drawing was right, and this one was right. Hans had asked her to promise one thing before the fever took his speech. Not to mourn him, he was a practical man who considered mourning a luxury the living could not always afford. What he asked was that she teach the method plainly and never mystify it. A heating bench is not a secret, he had said. It is a solution. If you make it a secret, it dies with you. If you make it plain, it outlives everyone. Clara folded the sackcloth and placed it in the wooden box where she kept the other drawings. Then she fed the fire and went to bed. The bench was warm beneath her, and in the morning there was work to do. The secondary crisis came in the last week of March, when winter remembered it had not finished. A late storm, not a blizzard on the scale of January 12th, but a 3-day blow with temperatures dropping below zero and winds strong enough to seal doors with packed snow, hit the plains on March 23rd. By this time, most homesteaders had burned through their winter fuel reserves. The families who had survived the January blizzard by burning furniture and fence posts had spent February and early March scrounging, borrowing, and buying at Silas's inflated prices. Their stores were thin. The Dalrymple family, 7 miles northwest, was in trouble. Orrin Dalrymple had been sick with lung fever since February. His wife, Maud, had 3 children under 8, and no fuel heavier than dried grass. Their iron stove was intact but useless without something to burn, and the March storm was producing temperatures that would kill a weakened man in an unheated house. Clara heard about it from Nettie, who had heard it from the mail carrier, who had passed the Dalrymple claim and seen no smoke from the chimney. "They have no wood," Nettie said, "and Orrin cannot stand." Clara looked at the storm pressing against her own windows. The bench was warm. The girls were fed. She had fuel for a week. "I need your husband's sled," she said. She loaded the sled with firebrick, pipe sections, clay already mixed to ratio, a sack of sand, and a bundle of tools. She packed enough brush fuel for 2 days of firing. She kissed the girls. Ruth would keep the firebox fed. She was old enough and had watched Clara do it 100 times, and she walked into the storm. The 7 miles took 4 hours. Clara arrived at the Dalrymple claim with ice in her eyelashes, and her hands numb inside 2 pairs of gloves. The house was a full soddy, better insulated than Clara's board and sod hybrid, but the stove was cold, and the air inside was not much warmer than the air outside. Orrin lay on a straw mattress under every blanket the family owned. His breathing was audible from the door. The 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, the oldest maybe 7, sat against the wall, wrapped together. Maud met Clara at the door with an expression that contained no hope. She had passed through hope 2 days ago and arrived at the blank efficiency of a woman managing a situation she expected to end badly. "I'm going to build a heating bench in your house," Clara said. "It will take 2 days. I need your stove out of the way, and I need you to keep the children clear of the work area." "A bench," Maud said. "An earthen bench with a flue inside it. It will heat this room with brush fuel. I have brought materials." Maud looked at the sled. She looked at Clara. She looked at the cold stove that had not been lit in 18 hours because there was nothing left to put in it. "Do what you need to do," she said. Clara built a simplified version. No firebrick, the Dalrymples could not afford it, and Clara had brought only enough for a basic firebox lining. Instead, she used fieldstone from the wall near the door, stacking it into a rough combustion chamber and lining the interior with a thick coat of clay. The flue path was shorter, only 12 feet, and the bench was smaller, built against the warmest wall of the soddy, where the earth backing would add its own thermal mass. She worked through the first night by lantern light while the storm shook the sod walls. Maud helped, packing clay where Clara pointed, holding pipe sections while Clara sealed the joints. The children watched from their huddle. Orrin coughed and slept and coughed again. By noon of the second day, the bench was packed and the chimney was tied in. Clara lit the first fire, corn cobs and dried grass, the only fuel available, and watched the draft. It drew. The smoke traveled down through the throat, along the short bench run, and up through the chimney. Maud held her hand near the bench surface and waited. An hour later, the surface was warm. 2 hours later, warmth radiated into the room. By evening, the children had moved from their huddle against the wall to the bench. They lay on it the way Clara's girls lay on hers, on quilts, side by side, their small bodies absorbing heat from below while the storm spent itself against the sod. Orrin lived. His fever broke on the 4th day after Clara's arrival, and whether that was because the room was warm enough for his body to fight the infection, or because luck favors the stubborn, Clara did not know and did not claim. What she knew was that a simplified bench, built in 30 hours by a woman who was not a mason using materials that cost almost nothing, had kept a family alive through a storm that would have killed them without it. If this story reminds you that knowledge shared freely can save the people around you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because Clara's bench was about to become something larger than one woman's survival. She walked home through the aftermath of the storm. The plains were white and silent and enormous. Her feet broke through the crust with each step, and the 7 miles took 5 hours. When she arrived, Ruth had the firebox burning, and Eliza was asleep on the bench. The room was warm. Clara sat down at the table and began drawing a simplified plan, a version of the bench that required no firebrick, no purchased pipe, and no skills beyond what she could teach in a single afternoon. A plan for people who had nothing except clay and time, and the willingness to learn. Hans would have approved. She could almost hear him correcting her angles. The simplified plan changed the scope of what Clara was doing. The original bench, her bench, was a carefully engineered system with firebrick, salvaged stovepipe, and Hans's precision at every critical joint. It worked beautifully, but it required $12 in materials and a level of skill that not everyone possessed. The Dalrymple bench had proven that a rougher version, built with field stone and shorter pipe runs and local clay, could still function, not as efficiently, not as elegantly, but enough to keep a room above freezing on fuel that grew wild within walking distance. Clara spent the first 2 weeks of April refining the simplified plan. She built a test bench behind her house, a 6-foot section using only fieldstone, clay, and 2 lengths of pipe she had scavenged from a collapsed shed. She fired it, measured the heat retention by feel, adjusted the clay ratio, and fired again. She tracked how long the surface stayed warm after each firing. 6 hours on the first attempt, 8 hours after she added a thicker mass layer, 10 hours after she packed earth behind the bench to create a thermal wall that radiated heat from both sides. She drew the final plan on a clean piece of sackcloth. It was simpler than the original. Fewer turns in the flue path, thicker walls to compensate for the lack of firebrick, a wider firebox that accepted rougher fuel. She labeled every dimension in words. She noted the clay ratio. She marked the spots where leaks were most likely and described how to test for them. Then she carried the plan to Nettie's house and taught it to her. Nettie, who had doubted the bench since September. Nettie, who had asked what happened when the smoke refused the downward turn. Nettie, who had come through the January blizzard burning furniture and who had spent every day since reconsidering what she thought she knew about heat. "Show me," Nettie said. "Show me the way you showed Greer and Dorothea. I want to build one in the milk room." Clara showed her. They spent 2 days together, mixing clay, testing ratios, laying pipe, packing the bench. Nettie was a faster learner than Clara expected. Her hands were strong from farm work, and her mind was precise from years of managing a household on margins so thin they could cut. The milkroom bench was 10 feet long, and it drew on the first firing. "I want to show Maud's sister," Nettie said, "and the Petersons, and the widow near the schoolhouse." "Show them," Clara said, "and teach them to show others. The more people who know this, the less anyone needs to depend on wood they cannot afford." The sentence hung in the air between them, and both women knew who it pointed at without speaking his name. Silas made his final move in late April. He sold a batch of stovepipe to a family named Rowell, recent arrivals who had come to the plains in February, too late to experience the January blizzard and too new to know the local dynamics. The Rowells had heard about Clara's bench and wanted to build one. They bought pipe from Silas because he was the only seller within hauling distance. The pipe was warped. Not visibly, the bends were subtle, the kind of defect a trained eye might catch, but a newcomer would miss. When the Rowells laid their flue path and fired the bench for the first time, the warped section created a gap at the joint where the pipe met the clay. The gap leaked. Smoke seeped into the bench mass, and from there into the room. The Rowells woke coughing at 2 a.m. and doused the fire and spent the rest of the night in cold. The story reached Silas before it reached Clara, because Silas had been waiting for it. "The bench nearly killed the Rowells," he told everyone who would listen. "Smoke in the room, children choking. I told you this would happen. That woman does not know what she is building, and the people she is teaching know even less." Clara heard about the failure from the storekeeper, who told her with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to take sides but needed her to know what was being said. She went to the Rowell claim that afternoon. It took her 20 minutes to find the problem. The warped pipe section was visible once she crawled beneath the bench form and ran her hand along the metal. The bend was slight, maybe a 1/4 inch off true, but at the joint, a 1/4 inch was the difference between a seal and a leak. She pulled the section and examined it. The warp was not from age or use. It was the kind of bend that happened when pipe was stored improperly, or, and Clara held this thought carefully, turning it over the way she turned clay in her hands when pipe was bent deliberately. She could not prove it. She did not try. What she did was replace the section with a straight piece from her own reserve, repack the joint, test it with a candle, and fire the bench. The draft drew clean. The room held warm. The Rowells' youngest child fell asleep on the surface before Clara left. She walked back to her claim in the long April light and did not speak about Silas to anyone. But she began inspecting every piece of pipe that passed through her hands, and she taught everyone she worked with to do the same. Roll the pipe on a flat surface. If it rocks, it is warped. If it is warped, it will leak. If it leaks, people die. The lesson was more valuable than anything Silas had intended. By May of 1888, Clara Hale had built or supervised the building of 9 heating benches across a stretch of south-central Nebraska that covered roughly 40 miles of prairie. 6 of them were the original design, firebrick firebox, salvaged pipe, clay and sand mass with Hans's throat geometry. 3 were the simplified version she had developed after the Dalrymple build, fieldstone firebox, shorter flue run, thicker mass to compensate for cruder materials. All 9 drew clean. All 9 held heat. All 9 had kept families alive through the worst winter the plains had produced in a generation. She did not count them for pride. She counted them the way she counted fuel, as a measure of distance between where she had been and where the next crisis might find her. A typical day in Clara's household that spring looked nothing like the desperate autumn that preceded it. She rose before the girls, fired the bench with a bundle of willow twists and a handful of dried grass. 10 minutes of active burning, no more, and by the time Ruth and Eliza were awake, the room was warm enough to wash and dress without shivering. Breakfast was cooked on the plate Hans had designed into the bench surface, a flat stone set above the hottest pipe section, where a pot of porridge or a pan of cornbread could heat without a separate fire. The economy of it still startled her. One fire, one fuel load, heat for the room, warmth for the bench, a cooking surface, and wash water warming in a pail set against the clay. The iron stove had demanded 4 separate acts of feeding to accomplish what the bench did with one. Visitors came most weeks. Some wanted to see the bench. Some wanted Clara to see theirs. She walked to claims she had never visited and inspected flue paths laid by people she had never met. People who had learned the method not from Clara directly, but from Nettie or Greer or Dorothea, who had learned it from Clara and passed it forward. The knowledge was moving the way heat moves through mass, slowly, steadily, without spectacle. She taught the way Hans had taught her, through action. She did not stand in front of a room and lecture. She knelt beside a half-built bench and showed people where to press the clay, how to smooth the throat, when to stop and test before going further. She corrected mistakes without judgment. She praised good work without flattery, and she said the same thing to every person she taught, because Hans had said it to her, and it was true. A heating bench is not a secret. It is a solution. If you make it plain, it outlives everyone. The girls adapted to the new rhythm of their lives with the elasticity that children possess and adults envy. Ruth, who was 10 now, could fire the bench herself. She knew the fuel, the timing, the sound the draft made when it was drawing well. She tested joints with a candle flame the way other children tested ice with a thrown stone, casually, competently, without thinking about how recently the skill had been impossible. Eliza, 7, treated the bench as furniture. She did her schoolwork on it. She napped on it. She pressed her cheek against the warm clay the way a cat presses against a sun-warmed wall. The bench was not remarkable to Eliza. It was her house. That ordinariness was the truest measure of what Clara had built. Revolution does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a warm surface that a child takes for granted. Silas Pruitt's reckoning came not with a single dramatic scene, but with the slow mathematics of a market he could no longer control. Through the winter, Silas had charged $4 a cord for delivered hardwood. In a normal year, desperation set the price. Families who had planned poorly or suffered setbacks had no choice but to pay what Silas asked, and Silas asked what the season would bear. But the spring of 1888 was not a normal year. 6 families who would have been his customers had built heating benches and burned brush instead of bought oak. 3 more were building benches as the ground thawed. The demand for delivered hardwood did not vanish entirely. Plenty of homesteaders still relied on iron stoves and conventional fuel, but it dropped enough that Silas felt the difference in his ledger. He responded the way a man responds when his livelihood contracts. He cut prices. $4 became $3. $3 became $2.50 for anyone who committed to a full winter's supply before September. The discounts were an admission that Silas himself would never have described as one, but every homesteader who saw the price drop understood what it meant. The mudbench woman had changed the math. The confrontation Clara had expected, the scene where Silas stood in her doorway and acknowledged what she had built, did not happen the way stories suggest it should. There was no single moment. There was instead a gradual erosion of hostility that Clara observed in fragments over the following months. In June, Silas sold pipe to a family building a bench and did not warp it. Clara checked. The pipe was true. She did not know whether this meant Silas had stopped sabotaging or had simply decided the risk was no longer worth the reward, and she did not ask. The result was the same. In August, Silas's hired hand, a young man named Bridger who hauled wood for Silas 3 seasons a year, came to Clara's claim and asked her to show him the bench. Not to build one for himself, to understand it. Silas won't say it, Bridger told her, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. But he knows the wood business is changing. He asked me to learn what you are doing so he can figure out what he is going to do instead. Clara showed him the bench. She showed him the clay ratio and the throat geometry and the testing methods. She did not withhold anything because Bridger worked for the man who had mocked her, sold warped pipe to the Rowells, and told the county her children would die from her pride. She showed him everything because Hans had made her promise to teach plainly and never mystify, and a promise made to a dead man is not conditional on the living. Bridger thanked her and left. Clara never learned what Silas did with the information, but the warped pipe stopped. The public accusation stopped. And when Clara walked through the mercantile, Silas no longer turned to the nearest customer to deliver his verdict on her sanity. The final piece of Silas's arc arrived in October of 1888, nearly a year after Clara had torn out her iron stove. A chimney fire broke out in the bunkhouse Silas used for his hauling crew, a long, low building heated by 2 iron stoves that Silas kept burning hard through the season. The fire started in a creosote-clogged flue and spread to the roof timbers before anyone could douse it. The bunkhouse burned. No one was killed, but Silas lost the building, the stoves, and 3 weeks of hauling income while his crew slept in tents. Clara heard about the fire from Nettie. She did not go to Silas. She did not offer help. She waited. On the 3rd day after the fire, Silas came to her. He arrived on foot. He did not bring his horse, which Clara interpreted as a choice. A man on horseback arrives with authority. A man on foot arrives asking. He stood outside her door and did not enter until she invited him. "I need a chimney," he said. "A proper one, not iron. Something that will not burn." "You need a masonry flue," Clara said, "lined with clay and firebrick, properly cured." "Can you build one?" "I can show you how to build one, or I can build it for you at cost of materials and 3 days of your crew's labor." Silas looked at the bench through the open door. He had not been inside her house since before the divorce, when he had delivered wood to Martin and glanced at the interior with the disinterested gaze of a man who considered himself above his customers. Now he looked at the bench the way everyone looked at it, with the specific attention of someone who was seeing a principle for the first time. "You burn brush all winter," he said. It was not a question. Willow, sagebrush, corn cobs, dried grass. And the room stayed warm. The room stayed warm. Silas nodded once. It was not an apology. Clara did not expect one. What it was, precisely, was a transaction, the moment when a man who had built his life on one set of assumptions accepted that the assumptions had changed. He would not say he had been wrong. He would not say Clara had been right. He would say he needed a chimney, and Clara would build it, and the exchange of labor and knowledge would accomplish what words could not. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He left. Clara built his chimney the following week. She lined it with firebrick and packed it with clay mixed to Hans's ratio, and when she tested the draw with a candle flame, the fire bent inward with a pull that would have made Hans smile. The man who arrived in November of 1888 was not looking for a heating bench. He was looking for a blacksmith who could repair a wagon axle, and the nearest blacksmith was 14 miles south and his wagon could not travel 14 miles with a cracked axle. He had stopped at Clara's claim because it was the nearest chimney smoke he could see from the road. His name was Leland Marsh. He was 37, from Pennsylvania, a carpenter by trade who had come west to build houses for the railroad towns sprouting along the new spur lines. He was lean and quiet, and he noticed the bench before he noticed anything else in the room. "That is not a stove," he said. "No." "What is it?" Clara showed him the way she had shown everyone, by touch, by explanation, by the candle test that made the draft visible. Leland listened the way a carpenter listens to structural information, with his hands as much as his ears. He pressed the surface. He tapped the clay and listened to the sound. He crouched beside the firebox and examined the firebrick chamber with the attention of a man who understood how materials behaved under stress. "The mass is doing the work," he said. "The mass is doing the work. And the pipe carries the heat through it. 20 feet of pipe. Every foot is another foot of storage." Leland straightened. "I can fix your roof." Clara looked at him. Her roof had been leaking since the blizzard. She had patched it with canvas and sod and prayer, and it leaked anyway, and every time it rained she moved the girls to the dry end of the bench and set pails under the drips. She had not asked anyone for help with the roof because there was no one to ask. Hans was dead. Nettie's husband had his own repairs, and Clara had spent 9 months proving she could build things herself, which made it difficult to admit that she could not build a roof. "I do not have money for lumber," she said. "You have clay and firebrick and the knowledge of how to keep a house warm through a Nebraska winter. I have lumber and tools, and the knowledge of how to keep a roof from leaking. I am suggesting a trade." The trade took a week. Leland repaired the roof, new joists where the old ones had rotted, fresh sod over split cedar shakes he carried in his wagon, a pitch seal along the ridge that would hold for years. Clara built a heating bench in his wagon camp shelter, a short one 8 feet, just enough to keep a man warm while he traveled between job sites. They worked in parallel, and what Clara noticed was that Leland did not watch her build the way a spectator watches. He watched the way a professional watches, tracking the sequence, noting the techniques, filing the information alongside his own knowledge of how things go together. They ate supper together on the 4th night, the girls between them on the bench, the room warm and dry for the first time since the blizzard. Ruth asked Leland whether he could build a shelf for her books. He said he could. Eliza asked whether he could build a bed that was warm like the bench. Leland looked at Clara. "She means a bench with a sleeping platform," Clara said. "I have been thinking about it. A wider section at one end with more mass beneath the surface. Hans sketched something similar before he died." "Show me the sketch." Clara showed him. Leland studied it, then took a pencil from his coat, a carpenter's flat pencil, not a charcoal stick, and drew modifications. He understood joinery. He understood load-bearing. He understood the thing Clara did not, how to build a wooden frame around an earthen mass so the two materials supported each other instead of fighting. The partnership was not courtship in any way that novels would recognize. There were no speeches. There were no declarations. There was a carpenter who recognized a builder, and a builder who recognized a carpenter, and the recognition was mutual and specific and grounded in the shared language of people who solve problems with their hands. Leland stayed through November. He left in December to fulfill a contract at a railhead 60 miles west. He returned in January with lumber enough for a proper addition to Clara's house, a second room, framed in wood, insulated with sod, heated by an extension of the bench that ran through the wall from the original room. Clara packed the clay around the pipe. Leland framed the walls. The girls carried stones. They married in March of 1889 in a ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher in Clara's house. Nettie was the witness. Elias Rourke was not invited, but sent a note that read, in its entirety, Congratulations. Keep the chimney clean. The marriage was built the way the bench was built, with available materials on a solid foundation, with enough mass to hold warmth through the seasons when warmth was hard to find. They did not agree about everything. Leland thought Clara should charge for her teaching. Clara thought charging would make the knowledge a commodity instead of a common good. They argued about it the way they argued about roof pitch and clay ratios with heat and precision, and the fundamental respect of two people who knew the other person's competence was real. Clara won the argument. She continued teaching for free. Leland continued building roofs for money. Between them, they assembled a life that was not comfortable by the standards of a city, but was sufficient by the standards of a place where sufficiency was the highest ambition most people allowed themselves. The years that followed compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the days fill with work instead of survival. Clara improved the bench design 3 more times. The tapered collar Hans had sketched became standard on every build she supervised. The cookplate was refined into a proper flat surface that could hold 2 pots and a kettle. The sleeping section, Leland's contribution, became the feature that convinced the most skeptical visitors, because a warm bed required no technical understanding to appreciate. By 1890, Clara had directly built or supervised 14 heating benches. By 92, the number was difficult to count because people were building them from her sackcloth plans without her involvement, passing the drawings from claim to claim the way recipes pass between kitchens. Nettie taught 6 families herself. Dorothea taught 4. Greer, who had been the first to ask Clara for help after the blizzard, became skilled enough to build a bench alone in 3 weeks, and he did so for 2 widows and a family that had arrived on the plains in summer with no understanding of what winter would demand. The benches were not all the same. Some were long and some were short. Some had cook plates and some did not. Some used firebrick and some used fieldstone, and one, built by a man who had no stone of any kind, used a firebox lined with 3 layers of clay so thick it took a week to cure. They all worked. Not identically. The firebrick versions drew better and stored heat longer, but they all worked. The principle was sound. The principle was always sound. Hans had been right about that. Fire was the delivery method. Mass was the bank. Ruth grew into a girl who could build a bench without supervision by the time she was 13. She had her mother's hands and her grandfather's instinct for brick, and she tested joints with a candle flame the way other girls tested bread with a finger pressed into dough, by feel, by habit, by the accumulated certainty of having done it enough times that the knowledge lived in her body. She taught Eliza, and Eliza taught the Dalrymple children, and the chain extended outward in all directions the way warmth extends outward from a heated mass, slowly, steadily, without flame. Clara lived out her days on the same Nebraska claim where she had torn out an iron stove in September of 1887 and replaced it with a bench of clay and pipe and faith in a principle her father had pressed into her hands when she was 8 years old. The claim grew. Leland added rooms, Clara added benches. The house that Elias Rourke had dismissed as a single room fit to sleep in became, over 2 decades, a sprawling, warm, sodden timber structure with heated mass running through its walls like veins through a body. In old age, Clara developed the habit of sitting with one hand resting on the bench seam nearest the firebox, feeling by touch what the fire was doing without rising to look. She could tell from the warmth under her palm whether the draft was strong or weak, whether the fire needed fuel or had enough, whether the clay was holding its heat or losing it through a seam that wanted repacking. It was the same gesture her father had shown her in Iowa when she was a child, hand flat on warm brick, reading the heat the way a blind person reads a page. She died in the spring of 1909, in the same room where she had built the first bench 22 years earlier. The bench was warm beneath her. It had been warm beneath her every day of those 22 years, through winters that tried to kill her, and summers that baked the clay until it smelled of minerals and dust. The fire in the firebox was low. Ruth tended it. Eliza sat beside her mother and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the warmth under them both did not say more plainly. 6 households learned from Clara directly. 14 benches bore her hand or her instruction. But the number that radiated outward from those 14, the benches built by people who learned from Clara, was never counted, because no one thought to count a thing that had become ordinary. Children in neighboring homesteads grew up calling any heated earthen bench Clara's bench, whether Clara Hale had built it or not. The name was not a monument, it was a description. It meant warmth. Clara Bennett Hale lived her entire adult life on a treeless stretch of south-central Nebraska, 12 miles from the nearest rail stop and 4 miles from the nearest neighbor with a working chimney. She arrived with $23, 2 daughters, and no way to heat a house through winter. She left a method that outlived her, a family that carried the knowledge forward, and a room that stayed warm when better supplied houses went cold. On January 12, 1888, the temperature on the Nebraska plains dropped more than 60 degrees in a matter of hours. The sky turned white. The wind erased the distance between the living and the dead, and 3 people in the county did not survive the night. Elias Rourke, who had spent 19 winters judging whether homesteaders would live or die, had stood in Clara's unfinished house 4 months earlier and delivered his verdict. "You can freeze by morning all the same as a fool, and if those girls wake cold, it will be on your pride." On the worst night of that storm, 2 girls slept on quilts spread over warm clay. The room held heat while the wind clawed at the walls. The fire in the firebox was nearly out. The bench remembered what the fire had given it, the way brick remembers the sun, and Clara Hale fed a handful of brush into the throat of the thing everyone had called a grave of mud, and the smoke drew down and the heat went into the mass, and the mass gave it back, steady and slow, while the coldest night on the plain spent itself against a woman who had learned from her father that iron throws heat fast, but brick keeps it after the flames are gone.